ask a favor of you. The softball mafia back there, try to keep them in line.
Why me? How about this fellow right here?
Fine, all of you. It'll probably take all of you. Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Nykirk. I'm the chair of the Department of History, Political Science, Sociology, and I get to introduce our speaker for today. First, a little bit of background. In 1952, Congress, by joint resolution, designated September 17th as Constitution Day to reflect the day on which the final version of the Constitution was signed in Philadelphia in 1787. In 2004, Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia secured passage of an amendment to a spending bill that mandates that every educational institution that receives federal funds must have programming on Constitution Day to teach students something about the Constitution. Now, you all know Geneva College is always ahead of the game. And so we've been doing this since the late 1800s, right? With Political Science 352. We teach you something about the Constitution, at least for many of you, in the fall semester. But we recognized after the 2004 thing that we better do something special. And so we have a tradition now that the GVAL's lecture in September is focused on something relating to the Constitution. For those of you who don't know, GVAL's is the Geneva Visiting Artist and Lecture Series. It's funded through the generosity of Iva Patterson and Dale Gilmore Visiting Artist and Lecture Series Fund that was endowed by Paul Gilmore from the class of 1931, and from the Staley Distinguished Scholar Lecture Series endowment. So we're very fortunate that those individuals have been willing to endow this series so that we can bring in speakers like our one for today. Some of you do need to show that you were here. I am less trusting than Dr. Zaffini, so there are sign-up sheets over there. Tari will be available. You can find your name and sign up and show you were here afterwards. Not that I don't trust some of you, but afterwards. I think there's a sign-up sheet over there for an education course. I guess Dr. Scheidemantel's finding his own students, but at least for my students over there. Also, a reminder before I introduce the speaker that you are invited to join him for lunch in the PDR between 11:30 and 1. If you want to talk more about any of the topics that come up today, just grab your lunch and come on in there. So our speaker today is Mr. Don Eberly. Don recently concluded a 40-year career in public, national, and international policy and diplomacy service. He has worked in multiple settings on Capitol Hill, in USAID and the Pentagon, the State Department. He was involved in civilian roles following the removal of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. He was also involved in policy making on the ground in Afghanistan, working in counterinsurgency. He has focused a lot of his career on thinking about civic life and public engagement. He has written books on this subject. He was one of the ones who put together the original White House Office of Faith-Based Initiatives that was a major concern of President Bush. And he has founded a number of think tanks and other public policy operations that focus both on thinking about civic engagement and especially on the role of fathers in family and societal life. So he's thought a great deal about the kinds of questions that are before us at Geneva College generally and in Political Science 352 in particular. There are questions that are very much before us as a nation, given especially the events of the last couple of weeks. And so he's going to be talking about civic engagement and civic life and how that relates to the Constitution. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Don Eberly.
Thank you very much. It's just a delight to be here, quite honestly, and thank you for coming, and especially those who are required to be here. Really appreciate that a lot. It's a great honor, and how timely this is to be focused on the Constitution. I've had a delightful time. I was here actually in late 1990s or early 2000s. I'm almost hesitant to say that because it's one of the many ways I can indicate how old I am. But I spoke at commencement and already got to know quite a number of key people on campus here. Last night I was treated to dinner by your distinguished provost. Thank you very much, Linda. And the Brain Trust, which is all assembled here. At least they're a representative of the tremendous professors you have here on campus. I think it's incredibly important that we have these discussions all across the country right now. The fact that we're reflecting on the Constitution and the U.S. founding should be replicated with this seriousness on every campus, in my opinion, because I think we honestly are looking for leadership in the emerging generations. I think this is a very big generational challenge that we have going forward. It's an easy time of national chaos and self-doubt to appreciate, difficult time to appreciate how towering an accomplishment our Constitution actually is. I don't know that human history has ever produced a collection of more brilliant minds, notwithstanding their faults as mortals. The late Chief Justice Warren Burger, who chaired the Commission on the Bicentennial of the United States Constitution, wrote, "Our Constitution has had as great an impact on humanity as the splitting of the atom." He wasn't commenting from a religious or moral point of view, as I am inclined to do. He was just simply saying the Constitution is a great gift to humanity, and we can't focus on it, reflect on it, talk about it enough. What is it about America's Constitution that produced such a claim? For one, it was a daring challenge to those who looked at history and concluded that abuses of human dignity and freedom by the powerful could not be prevented. It was an act of defiance. That the Constitution is being tested should be very obvious to us. As we meet the most widely recognized malady of our time is the raw divisions and polarization of our land, and many are unsure what the remedy is. An important question is it possible that renewed interest in the principles of the Constitution could itself be a potential cure? Leading constitutional scholar Yuval Levin thinks so. By rediscovering the genius of the Constitution, Americans would continue to argue about this or that provision and how it should be applied, but at least be arguing within a shared framework and common interests. Americans would also come to realize the danger of turning every issue of disagreement in our society into a quest for power and domination. As James Madison captured it, our system of government is the surest of all reflections of the people. And it's also one that's dependent on both the willingness and the capacity of the people to rule themselves, to take responsibility, to exercise restraint, to not punish ideological opponents, and work through non-state societal networks and associations to find meaningful lives and to find solutions to our problems. As the founders saw it, the chief threat to our system of ordered and balanced liberties was the abuse of power. No other question compared in importance as the founders pondered doubts about the republic's durability. And as they understood it, threats to liberty had multiple sources, including liberty itself, as we see now in our drift toward political violence. Madison thought that a well-constructed constitutional government could go a long way to break and control the violence of faction, but that causes of faction are sown in the nature of man, and he was skeptical that a written document alone would be sufficient. I believe this is what John Adams meant when he said, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. So folks, my argument is that we are in a crisis having to do with society and culture, and the political crisis is only secondary to that. What I like the most about renewed interest in the content of the Constitution is that the moment you open the discussion, it takes you deep into the most basic questions about reality and human nature. The entire organization of government was designed for human beings, which unavoidably takes account of the human condition, and which means there are theological and epistemological dimensions throughout all of it. We live at a time when a lot of people are entertaining bold, even radical departures from America's founding principles, as if it's possible to start over. So this is a college campus where it's your job to think. I will present a thought experiment or two that allows you to imagine being a founding father or mother of a new independent republic. So here's the first. This group of 200, 300, you're dropped on an island, and you are informed that you'll be spending the rest of your life there. And so you realize you wake up in the morning, you need civil government. So you get together and you reflect on it all, and you realize this is a pretty homogeneous group. Most of you are Christians of some degree of fidelity, and you have a lot in common and so forth. It should be easy, right? Well, then it gets more complicated because on day 2, 300 more arrive and are informed they'll be spending the rest of their lives on the same island. And here the range of beliefs is as wide as you can find, including atheists, outright secularists, agnostics, and so forth. And they send a delegation to your side of the island and with a simple question: what is it you intend to do with us and the civic compact you have in mind forming here? So the interesting thing about this thought experiment, it gets us to consider that in this broad discussion of faith in public life, believers do not occupy an island alone, if that's not clear to us by now. The term pluralism is not merely a term of politics, it's a description of reality. We occupy space with non-believers, dogmatic secularists, and atheists, however we might feel about that. I want to open this discussion about the Constitution by just declaring that this topic is contentious, and it always has been, and not merely between Christians and secularists. As we'll see, the founders struggled with it, particularly on church-state matters, and we still argue and litigate over it. I will start by drawing from 2 personal experiences from my long career in public policy, 2 events that took me very close to these very deep constitutional questions and controversies. One of the more consequential things I was asked to do, as referenced earlier, was to design, staff, and roll out the president's faith-based office under President Bush. The main objective was fairly obvious: to open federal funding pipelines to faith-based service organizations, which were highly effective, always community-based, and often hurting for funds, denied funding for no good reason. Bush was fond of referring to caring for the least, the last, and the lost, so this made perfect sense. Immediately, we ran into a buzzsaw of religion and state issues. Opposition from secular church-state separationists was predictable, immediate, and ferocious. I spent weeks trying to talk sense to major media outlets to little avail. But that's not where it ended. Many evangelicals were very wary, especially Baptists, whose history tends to lead them to strict separation. Because the funding would be channeled directly to religious organizations, we had to pass constitutional muster, which meant adopting something called charitable choice, which separated proselytization and religious instruction from direct social service delivery. Well, immediately evangelicals saw this as ceding control of religious programming to the state, and they rightly pointed out that all these activities are baked together into the same kind of interaction with clients, and they said, well, if this is the case, if we need to actually segregate the faith-based element from social service provision, the bill should not be passed. So we had the choice of passing a bill that either disappointed our friends but was constitutional, or please friends but was unconstitutional, or end up doing nothing. To complete the story and add drama, the whole enterprise was interrupted by the terrorist attack on 9/11. Launched by Muslim extremists who had a very different idea of how religion coupled with politics. Because my background and life commitment has been in the area of civic community or civil society, Internationally, this translates to a large extent into building civic and governing institutions, pluralistic parties, rule of law, constitutions, and so forth. I was tapped to work on the post-war reconstruction of Iraq. This is a country overwhelmingly Muslim. Iraq is 2/3 Shia and 1/3 Sunni, and ethnically Arab, Persian, and Kurd, with no history of democracy. Some senior officials were determined to establish a secular Western-style constitution, which I resisted, oddly enough, as an American Christian, because it violated their basic cultural arrangement. For one thing, religion was so baked into their culture that it was one of the few unifying forces. For another, it wasn't for us to change something so fundamental within another culture under international law. More importantly, however, Muslims didn't want to hear about secularism. It was the very thing in their view that was destroying Western culture. They feared we were on a mission to secularize their society just the way we did our own. And as I talked to aging, older Iraqis, they talked about a time in their lives when it was the relationship with the more Christian then West was something that they were very comfortable with as Abrahamic cousins, but now our society and Western civilization was turning in a secular direction. To me, what's fascinating about the two examples I've noted is they describe how the Constitution, everywhere, be it in Iraq or in America, is fitted to a people and their culture. They grow up out of the subsoil of a society. So you've come to learn. So let me present the question. Forget about what you've heard about religion in this state. On theological grounds, how do you think the relationship between faith and the state should be arranged under the government? Every constitutional order is based on a set of premises. My favorite thought-provoking statement by a founder was offered by James Madison, who said, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." Furthermore, if angels were to govern, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. There's no statement in the founding period, in my opinion, that better captures the core premise of our constitutional system. Quite simply, men and women aren't angels, and giving them freedom comes at a risk. The Muslim constitution does not start with "we the people," and thus the people living under it expect little and have little expected of them. In our system, everything is expected of the people for democratic society to work. Yuval Levin, and by the way, his book, American Covenant, is really worth your time. He's one of the few people who's really spoken into our moment politically with an eye toward using the constitutional values to bring peace to our land. But he describes the Constitution as almost analogous to the soul of the body politic, as it describes the innermost character of our society and the meaning of citizenship and authority. What's missing today, except in select quarters, are the topics that were of interest to the Founding Fathers, which is the social prerequisites of democratic government, or what the founders called necessary supports, or what one historian called the forgotten foundations of democracy. This is what should interest and concern us as we look out over our troubled land. The rallying cry today seems to be that democracy is in trouble, or the system is broken. Most agree with this to some degree or another, 70% of the American people, in fact. But we must ask ourselves, what in particular is the trouble that so troubles us? In one sense, the Republic has been in peril since its founding, precisely because the founders were aware of human nature. The founding generation was deeply aware of the vulnerabilities of the new Republic, captured best by Franklin's famous line as he exited the convention, "You have yourselves a republic if you can keep it." Lincoln talked about the impermanence of our political institutions. He said that a nation can consist of its territory, its people, and its laws. But the only thing that's assured of being non-perishable is basically the territory. Keep that image in mind. Conflict and division have been around, actually, from the beginning, but what's new is the scale of social fragmentation, the violent disagreement that seems to persist, and moral confusion. As one political observer put it, today's politics is maniacally partisan, factional, and tribal, characterized by an instinctive hatred for not only the views of the opposition, but the existence of the opposition itself. Red and blue Americans increasingly inhabit distinctly different worlds and different realities, and the deeper the red or blue, the more decisions, including friendships and even marriage, are made according to ideology. A significant minority of partisans wish their opponents didn't exist, and a worrisome minority imagines violence as an option. What may be unique today is the absence of a moral compass that is broadly shared, even on so basic a level as how we view and treat each other. I want us to focus on that. Imago Dei is something that we as believers value to the extent that that basic notion, which was a premise behind the Constitution, self-evident truths, we are in peril of dehumanization, and that's the word I typically use to describe what's at work within our culture. It's very serious. So we're in trouble because we've ignored the founders' warnings and are looking for solutions mostly in the wrong place. Their uniform belief was that the human race is flawed and prone towards selfishness. This was actually viewed as something that rarely escaped attention because it deserved their attentions. They were very committed to studying the lessons of history. As historian Clint Rossiter put it, the nature of man is the key to all questions of political power and organization. Unlike the founding period, the vast majority of the discussion about what ails democracy in America today focuses on little more than the machinery of elections or the functioning of government. One can regularly hear concerns about such technical functions as gerrymandering, the filibuster, executive versus congressional powers, the Electoral College, fairness and integrity of elections, the power of money and interest groups, and an assortment of other functional aspects. Important topics for you political science folks, so I don't want to diminish it. I'm making a different point. Some worry about judicial overreach, and we should. Others worry about unelected bureaucrats operating within a deep state, and we should. And many worry about the reliability of our systems for tallying votes, and we should. Of course, if what ails us is an alleged procedural or structural problem, our natural response is to search for a quick procedural fix. So we're told by some to expand the size of the Supreme Court and the filibuster, elect presidents by majority vote, and so on. By others, we're told we must amend the Constitution, pass more laws, and promote a menu of government reforms. What we find today is an unceasing interest in expanding the act of voting, the activity of voting, and little interest, commensurate interest, in shaping the character of the voter. Consider how we view citizenship, which is the foundation building block of a healthy democracy. The most widely held measure of democratic success appears to be little more than voter turnout. That's it. To listen to the public debate today, citizenship appears to be reduced to little more than showing up on election day. The structural reforms that I've described are almost always aimed at releasing into public life unrefined and unrestrained expressions of the popular will, without any thought given to the value of moderating or restraining the popular will, or by promoting a view of citizenship that balances rights with responsibilities. This would be horrifying to the founders, who believed that unchecked popular passions would become the main problem for a system that granted so much direct power to the people. And should neither be any more evidence of uncontrolled, intemperate passions affecting our public life than what we see today. American writer Russell Kirk captured it well: a society in which men and women are morally adrift, ignorant of norms, and intent chiefly upon gratification of appetites will be a bad society, no matter how many people vote and no matter how formal one's liberal institution may be. So there's either control within or there's increased control without, as Edmund Burke alluded to. The less there is within, there will be more without. And this is the nature of expanding powers of government over a dysfunctional society. What preoccupies many Americans today and what preoccupied the founders are two different things. What we have largely forgotten or are willfully ignoring are the moral and social prerequisites, or what I call the software of democratic governance, civic and moral formation, and yes, even spiritual formation in our land. We must ask a different set of questions. If our system of government is the surest of all reflections of the people, what is the nature of the good society, the good person? What is the full scope of citizenship that the founders had in mind for a healthy democratic society? We are making irrational demands on our government to perform and almost no demands these days on the people. When the capacity for individual self-governance declines, we naturally and perpetually fight over rules, with the winning party increasingly taking a winner-take-all approach to exercising power. Interest in the content of democracy, the character of the people, or a vision for the common good suffers. My invitation to the next generation, this, yes, is you, the next generation of reformers, is to suspend interest in the functional failures of government and focus instead on the necessary social and moral preconditions for a healthy democratic society. Focus on social capital. We could spend the rest of the day talking about what we mean by that. But I've always believed that politics and government are to a large extent reflective of the people, which is to say they're downstream. Politics is downstream from the people. You get pretty much in government what is flowing out of society. One of the reasons American politics is so dysfunctional and so divisive is precisely because Americans of all stripes now expect things of it it simply cannot deliver. We look to politicians and parties to deal with social epidemics, ranging from innumerable addictions, gender and racial inequalities, a seemingly inexhaustible list of health epidemics, loneliness, family breakdown, obesity, declining mental health among boys and girls, and the price of eggs, and yes, even the decline of Christianity in the culture. This is what we're loading on politics today, my friends. There is precious little discussion, even among Christians, about the limits of politics. And here I'm talking about formal public politics. You can define politics in any number of ways. It's little wonder that many believe their institutions are failing them. Why? We've overloaded them with expectations that they can't possibly meet. We want politics to do the work of building and serving society, and it's just as likely that on its way to solving a few problems, politics as it's being practiced may weaken society further. And I would argue that indeed it is. And I do not mean by this, folks, a standard case for limited government. No, it's simply the fact that we've overloaded public life generally with expectations that simply can't be met, and the reach for power only inspires a deepening nihilism. Politics in our lives and our society is wildly out of balance, both reflecting and fueling society's disorder. Some will say we need to do politics better, and of course we do. But I want to suggest that the omnipresence of politics in society is itself a major problem. Today, politics is a colonizing force. It steps parasitically into vacuums created by the retreat of genuine human connection and values. In a healthy culture, politics is of secondary concern and takes place at the periphery of the pulsing life of society. Elections happen, there are winners and losers, and then people go about their lives with minimal attention to the noise of politics or concerns about it intruding at work, home, or places of worship. Your generation will need to come to terms with what I believe is the main reason much of life has become politicized, which is the dominance of social media. And this is not to be a talk on social media, but it has to be confronted. We tend to celebrate its empowering aspects, as we should, but the growing tendency toward political radicalization and violence should be sobering to all of us. Social media enables people with an interest in rare butterflies or birds to find each other. Those who love choral music, fine art, cathedrals, and classic cars are able to find each other. But here is the catch. So can haters and peddlers of violent misinformation each find each other worldwide. Paranoid and dangerous cults form. Fascists and anti-Semites white supremacists, and 100 different species of extremists can all find each other with ease, and their pathologies quickly metastasize. This phenomenon is unprecedented in human history, and we have not yet figured out what to do about it. And unless you're interested in curtailing civil liberties and so forth, this is again a social movement waiting to be born. This is a societal problem that's bleeding very seriously into politics. So, in my estimation, we need to advocate among ourselves new norms. Manners are more important than law because, to a large extent, the law rests upon the active use of manners, as Edmund Burke put it. New norms around social media use, and they must be applied to every single person who ingests a regular diet of toxic social media. We consider them as culpable, yes, culpable, because they help keep alive a media ecosystem that spreads the virus of anger, fear, grievance, and contempt for one's opponents. From my perspective, every single issue in public life winds its way back to the ultimate question: will we remain a nation of laws, or will we become a nation of vengeful rulers who take turns operating above the law to reward their faction? There is no area of greater consequence for our society that has abandoned a commitment to truth than in the area of rule of law. To reject truth outright is to reject the founders' claim that we can institute our government on the basis of self-evident truths. At the deepest level of our culture, we're experiencing an epistemological crisis, the simple explanation for which is that we're living in a land in which large portions of the population have different understandings of reality. When the law is no longer backed by moral argument, it becomes merely a reflection of popular will, the majority will. One side wins and another loses until the next election when it's all reversed. The law itself comes to serve as a partisan tool, creating a downward spiral of using power of the state against political opponents. Historians who've studied the collapse of the Roman Republic describe a process of disintegration that starts with the abuses of power gradually expanding to major breaches, all justified by the actions of their political opponents. One abuse and corrupt act led to another, multiplying as rival factions exploited loopholes and did end runs around the law for short-term advantage. Abuses slowly wore down the system until there was no will to defend it. There was no source of restoration because the will of the people had been so exhausted. In our time, successive administrations from each party have applied executive powers and the use of executive privilege to punish opponents and pardon friends, weaken or ignore established law, or sidestep accountability by the courts, producing a cycle of copycat abuses, all justified by the behavior of the other. Our Constitution, without the rule of law, and this is if you're around and we connect again in 10 years, our Constitution without the rule of law is a piece of paper. It's a piece of paper. Rule of law must live in our hearts and minds. You see, many have written about democracy as not being sufficiently geared with antibodies sufficient for the viruses that can rise up. Democracy is an empty vessel to some extent into which we pour the content of our collective lives. And it can take us anywhere. The rule of law is absolutely critical. And if we don't renew our interest in rule of law, much of the language of the Constitution itself bears very little relevance. And here's an important application of this. The challenge for Christians is very straightforward. We either want protection from the state to live out and express our faith freely, which requires a uniform application of rule of law, meaning it applies to everyone, or we want to take our turn using the power of the law against our opponents, just as many believe they are using their power against us. It's a huge decision, I think, that runs through our community. I mentioned earlier that the Constitution was fitted for a particular people. An important question that comes up, and I'm sure it's come up in your classes with some current authors, is what happens if society changes fundamentally from what the founders considered necessary to sustain a constitutional republic? Well, as Os Guinness pointed out in his recent book, Our Civilizational Moment, and I would encourage the reading of that as well, we are facing a wide and deepening chasm between the principles of our founding and those of the heirs of secular political revolutions, such as the French Revolution, which looked at society through a very different set of lenses. For one, it was to absorb society into the state, to use the state to engineer society, attack religion, centralize power, capture and twist the language of freedom and equality, and erode all forms of resistance, all the mediating institutions of civil society, with the family at the center. Decentralized units of authority are thought of as barriers to the advance of the powers of the central state. Remarkably, these principles of social and cultural revolution led to disaster, but they migrated to many of the intellectual capitals of the world, where they continue to find a warm reception, particularly in university humanities and philosophy departments. One consequence is that we have abandoned the concept of the individual as nested in a broad network, a social network of family, community, and places of worship, and replaced it to a large extent, in certain segments of the public at least, with the view of the individual as autonomous and sovereign, whose only objective is experiencing an expanding range of private personal choices and little else. In many quarters, freedom has been redefined from what was traditionally held to basically the practice of nihilism, which rejects all authority except my own, and reduces all of society to an unrelenting, chaotic, and bitter fight for power. So the question that arises is, if our government has become thoroughly secular, should an attempt be made to make it more religious in character, not merely protective of religious freedoms, but more overtly religious in its design? Is religious liberty enough, or should we try to somehow Christianize the state, whatever that actually looks like in reality? There's a significant debate about this. The claim is that our democracy as currently constituted on secular grounds can only lead in one direction, and that is the evisceration of the very principles that shaped it in the first place. It's actually an interesting diagnosis. I suspect some of you are probably reflecting pretty deeply on that. We may agree on the nature of the disease while questioning the recommended cure. I have two reservations, one theological and one pragmatic. What this school of thought seems to be saying is that the sins of materialism, extreme individualism, and militant secularism are themselves the product of the Constitution. And what it furthermore seems to be saying is that mankind is wicked because we've granted him too much freedom, not merely because he is intrinsically inclined toward sin. But more important to consider, so we should, before we rush to actually embrace a serious revision of the Constitution, I would point out that there's a decline in support for the Constitution on the secular left as well, for diametrically opposite reasons. The fear that secular America is now facing the threat of a resurgent Christian conservatism. If a Constitution were to be drawn up today, I'm pretty confident it would not resemble the one shaped by our founders. To offer my own point of view, somewhat facetiously, I think we need a constitutional amendment that simply reads, "We got it right the first time." But with the added advice that we need to pursue spiritual renewal and moral reformation to actually make it work as intended, and that's the work of society, not the state. The call to exercise the rights and responsibilities of citizenship should be heeded by all of us. Our system makes it possible, and we'd be foolish not to exercise that right and that responsibility. However, and I want to conclude with some reflections on the politicization of faith. As a lover of the gospel, the most concerning encroachment of politics is the increased pressure to politicize faith and even the church itself. One consequence for the reputation of the gospel, of grace in the public domain, is that it's very difficult to promote Christian morality without contributing, if only inadvertently, to cultural Christianity or civil religion or to a works-based religion. Evangelicals are now overly identified as people whose faith is motivating them to promote religious and moral rules in the public square. The greatest impact could be on the incursion of politics into the church itself. We need to appreciate the lessons of history. When Constantine became emperor in the 4th century, persecuted Christians were suddenly relieved of their suffering. Christianity suddenly became popular. Many turned to Christianity because it was now the in-group, not the out-group. The suffering church became the church triumphant, and then the church militant, and then the church imperial. What happens to the church when it feels a grip on power was described by Edward Gibbon, who was one of the authoritative sources on ancient Rome, as the following. He said famously, "The various modes of worship which prevailed in the Roman world were all considered by the people as equally true, by the philosophers as equally false, and by the magistrate as equally useful." What happens to the Christian faith during that experiment in Christendom should be reflected upon very carefully by every generation. The reasonable objective of stopping the government from doing harm to religious practice is steadily replaced by an expanding interest in power for the furtherance of faith, moving from a defense of the rights to practice faith toward an offense has real ramifications. This takes us back to a recurring caution captured by John Locke, whose 2 treatises on the government was second only to the Bible as the most quoted source during the founding. He said, "The care of souls cannot belong to the civil magistrate. Only true and saving religion consists of inward persuasion of the mind, without which nothing can be acceptable to God." At the core of this understanding is the firm belief that the state is not a redemptive institution, and there is nothing to be gained by layering all kinds of theological language or claims onto it, which this was the view of the founders. This doesn't mean that they favored a secular state or a naked public square. Hardly. Many turned away from the establishment of religion on solid religious grounds. Madison concluded that the establishment of religion was bad for religion, rendering minds and souls lazy and torpid. It induced a kind of mental slavery unworthy of free men. And we see the effects of this sort of state-sponsored religion across much of Europe. There's a growing tendency in various quarters today to say that to make our country more Christian, we must affect legislative and administrative functions in support of Christian faith, cloaked in many cases with sectarian and even evangelical language. This surfaced during deliberations over the Constitution. Madison was quite animated in his belief that the injection of terms like Savior, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit was almost sacrilegious, a defilement of the sacred, because government is neither competent nor to be trusted in adjudicating religious beliefs, however pure and acceptable devout believers might find them. As believers, our greatest challenge may be reestablishing a basis for believing in objective truth or transcendent moral order without needlessly generating confusion over the core claims of the gospel. I hope in your studies that you're able to leave Geneva with a solid understanding of many of these theological tools of public life and government, the importance of spheres, saving versus common grace, general revelation versus special revelation, the state and society, and natural moral law. These are all tools that were familiar to the founders. And now, these issues, I must say, have been adjudicated continuously, generation to generation. So the important question is, how should we view religion and society and church and state? What arrangement do we believe best protects the integrity of faith and advances the pure, undiluted gospel? The starting point in a sound public theology is to repeat, appreciating what is the nature and purpose of the state. Jesus said, "Give unto Caesar." He didn't say, and oh, by the way, accept Caesar's offer of kind assistance in bringing spiritual renewal to your community. I started out with a thought experiment and want to return to it, but not the earlier one. That was Fantasy Island. We imagined ourselves on an island. This is not fiction. This is actually close to reality. I run into people who say, well, maybe their state or region should secede from the Union. Aside from how impractical that would actually be, that's certainly an option to be evaluated theoretically and discussed here on campus. What would that look like? So let's think about how that would work. Let's say this county decides it's tired of all the shenanigans around it. It's going to secede from both the state and the nation. You wake up in the morning a resident of an independent, free republic. You got what you wanted. Now what? Now, the business of government is your business, and you'll be needing a constitution, hence the exercise. The first question is, where are your Madisons, Washingtons, and Adams? Where are they? The second question is, assuming you agree with those founders that men are not angels and actually are people prone to faction, violence, and vice, how would you structure this new republic's foundational principles to achieve the peace, tranquility, and prosperity of your new country? I will offer my own brief framework to fill in some of the gaps and to suggest a direction, some of the political and ideological perspectives that one might consider. I would offer as a mission statement an initial framing as follows. First, our challenge is to get the state to operate within its limited God-ordained role and to protect the authority centers, chiefly the family, our places of worship, the mediating institutions of civil society that operate both to serve society and generate important social capital, but also as a bulwark against too powerful government. Second, promote a moderate and restrained definition of freedom combined with individual responsibility. Third, constrain the abuse of power by ensuring the rule of law, and embrace the self-evident truth that all men and women are deserving of dignity and rights because they were made in the image and likeness of God, even those with whom we vociferously disagree. And as a final comment, if you really want a society different from the one you tried to escape, with all of its factions, turmoil, and threats, if you really want your new system to work and achieve its potential, go to work on building a society that is spiritually and morally aligned with it, just as our forebears did. And finally, for all believers, whatever your partisan views, we must return again and again to the scriptures for wisdom. I find so many people that now consider themselves, without even stopping and thinking about it, freedom fighters, surging into action on the basis of any kind of call, without thinking actually about what we're for. We're freedom for what? So we need to, how should we then think about politics in light of what's been discussed here today? How does it relate to the gospel? How does it relate to our being faithful to our ultimate Savior and King? So as believers, whatever our partisan view, we must return again and again to the scripture for wisdom and never assume that political and social reforms are more important or enduring than the redeeming work of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thanks again, and if I understand our timing, we have no? We're out of time? Okay, we had 1 minute, but that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. If you do have questions, Mr. Eberly will be available up here for a few minutes. And again, you're welcome to come to lunch in the PDR and continue some of these conversations. Thank you.